Can you really not see me?
I can still feel your warmth.
Why did you hide this?
He had survived 3 assassination attempts, 2 hostile takeovers, and 1 very awkward Christmas with his mother-in-law. But nothing prepared Kang Min-jae for the day he realized his wife had been going blind for a year, and he was the last man in Seoul to find out. If you believe love should be honest, even when the truth is scary, hit that like button right now. And subscribe, because trust me, you do not want to miss what Kang Min-jae is about to lose sight of. Only the cold-hearted skeptics scroll past a story like this one. Let's go. Seoul's underworld ran on one rule. Kang Min-jae did not lose. Not money, not territory, not men. He collected debts the way other men collected stamps. Quietly, patiently, with the calm certainty that every collection was inevitable, like gravity or taxes, or your uncle bringing up politics at Thanksgiving. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Men who owed Min-jae money tended to develop a spontaneous, almost religious devotion to punctuality. So when the warehouse on Yeongdongpo's edge went up in flame and gunfire that night, with Min-jae bleeding out on cold concrete like a discarded receipt nobody wanted for a return, the smart money in 3 different crime families quietly celebrated. Champagne got popped in at least 2 penthouses. One rival even ordered a cake. It said, "Congratulations." Premature. Deeply premature. Because the smart money forgot to check the shadows. A woman appeared through the smoke. No mask, no army, no dramatic entrance music, just 2 steady hands and a stubbornness sharper than the bullets slicing the air around her. She didn't scream. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed Min-jae by the collar of his very expensive, very ruined suit and dragged him block by block, while the warehouse behind them turned into the world's most expensive bonfire. He drifted in and out, catching fragments, the smell of smoke, the sting in his ribs, a woman's voice muttering something that sounded suspiciously like, "You people and your enemies, I swear," before the world went dark completely. When he came to, she was gone. No name, no number, no calling card with a menacing logo, which, frankly, disappointed his lieutenant, who collected those things like baseball cards. All she left behind was a thin silver bracelet, glinting faintly in the ash, a joke the universe was clearly playing on a man who prided himself on knowing everything worth knowing in this city. Min-jae spent 3 months looking for her. 3 months. This was a man who could locate a single misplaced diamond somewhere in the murky bottom of the Han River using nothing but rumor and intimidation. His network of informants, hackers, and disturbingly well-connected noodle vendors could find anyone. And yet, nothing. Not a name, not a face, not so much as a grainy security still. It was, frankly, insulting. Somewhere in this city of 10 million people lived the one woman Kang Min-jae could not buy, threaten, locate, or intimidate into cooperation, and it was driving him quietly, expensively insane. Fate, ever the comedian, finally handed her over in the most unremarkable way possible. A cafe, 2 coffees, a bracelet slipping off a stranger's wrist and clinking softly against the table between them. "Sorry," she said, scooping it up before he could even process what he was looking at. "It does this. Very dramatic bracelet. Very high maintenance." Her name was Amara. She apologized for the noise before she even looked up at him properly, and when she did, there was no flicker of recognition in her eyes. No gasp. No, "It's you." No cinematic string swell. Either she genuinely didn't know she was staring at the man she dragged out of hellfire 3 months ago, or she was pretending not to, which Min-jae found, against every instinct honed by a decade of reading liars for a living, infinitely more interesting than the alternative. He should have walked away. Men in his position did not chase mysteries. Mysteries got you shot, or worse, emotionally invested. Instead, he ordered a second coffee and asked if he could sit down. She hesitated, just a beat too long, like someone doing quiet math behind her eyes, then smiled and gestured to the empty chair. Kang Min-jae, a man who did not lose, sat down across from the one person in Seoul who had absolutely no idea what she'd just gotten herself into. Neither did he. 3 weeks in, Kang Min-jae discovered something no rival, no rat, no disgruntled accountant had ever managed to teach him: how to feel completely, hopelessly outmaneuvered by a woman who wanted absolutely nothing from him. It started with the money. He offered to pay off her rent for a year. A small gesture, the kind of thing that made lesser women weep with gratitude and greater women weep with strategic gratitude. Amara laughed so hard she nearly choked on her tea. "You want to pay my rent? Sir, I don't even let my own mother pay my rent, and she birthed me." He offered protection next. A driver, 2 guards. The standard courtesy extended to anyone who dragged him out of a burning building, and therefore now existed on his very short list of people who were allowed to live forever. She declined that too, with the same easy, maddening smile. "If I needed a man with a gun following me around, Min-jae, I would have married one already." He was, by every metric that mattered in his world, losing. And losing, for Kang Min-jae, had always meant something was about to go catastrophically wrong. Instead, for the first time in a decade, losing felt like exhaling. She was a puzzle box with no visible hinges. She remembered the name of a barista she'd met once, 6 months ago, along with the barista's dog's name, her dog's vet's name, and probably the vet's childhood nickname. Yet, she'd misplaced her own keys inside her own apartment, with the reliability of a Swiss train schedule running in reverse. She loved sunsets the way poets claim to, but never actually demonstrate, dragging him to rooftops, riverbanks, the hoods of parked cars, and then, without fail, she'd leave right as the colors started bleeding into dusk. "You're going to miss the best part," he told her once, nodding toward the horizon as it deepened toward violet. "I've seen enough sunsets," she said, already standing, already walking. "I like them better in memory anyway." He didn't understand the sentence. He would, eventually. Not yet. She also, curiously, never went to crowded parties. Birthday dinners, business galas, the loud, clinking chaos of Seoul's nightlife. She declined every single one, always with the same soft, unreadable smile, never with a reason attached. His advisors noticed. His advisors noticed everything, which was, unfortunately, their entire job description. "She's hiding something," his lieutenant said one evening, arms crossed, the posture of a man who had built his entire career on being suspicious of things other people called romantic. He was loyal, fiercely, almost religiously loyal, which was precisely why Min-jae trusted his instincts over almost anyone else's in the organization. No family anyone can verify, no political ties, no leverage. A woman like that either has nothing to lose or everything to hide. Or, Min-jae said, she's simply not interested in what everyone else wants. That's what worries me. It should have worried Min-jae too. Every lesson his father ever taught him, every scar on his body, every enemy currently plotting his downfall from a rival penthouse. All of it screamed the same warning. Unreadable people are dangerous people. And yet here he was, 6 months later, standing in front of his entire organization, announcing that he was marrying her. The room did not celebrate. His advisors exchanged the particular silence of men calculating exit strategies. His lieutenant said nothing at all, which, for a man who always had something to say, said everything. "You're marrying a woman with no family, no history, and no ambition," one advisor said carefully, choosing each word like it might detonate. "In our world, sir, that's not romantic. That's a blank check with someone else's name on it." Min-jae only smiled, the same smile his enemies had learned to fear right before they lost everything. "Good," he said. "Then no one can accuse her of marrying me for anything I already own. Here's a question for you, watching this unfold from the outside. If the people around you built their entire trust in someone off of paperwork and family trees, would you be brave enough to trust the person standing in front of you instead? Drop your answer below. Only the cynics stay quiet. The wedding was small, quiet, and deeply, aggressively against everyone's professional advice. Amara wore ivory. Min-jae wore the same calm expression he wore before signing contracts worth more than small countries. Neither of them noticed his lieutenant standing at the very back of the room, not smiling, not celebrating, watching Amara the way a man watches a fuse he hasn't found the end of yet. His lieutenant waited exactly 11 days after the wedding before he did what loyal men do best. Something nobody asked him to. He told himself it wasn't betrayal. It was protection. Kang Min-jae had built an empire on information, on knowing things before they became problems. And somewhere along the way, he'd stopped applying that same rigor to the woman now sleeping in his bed every night. Someone had to. If it turned out to be nothing, no harm done. If it turned out to be something, well, better his lieutenant find it first than an enemy. So he pulled every string his loyalty had ever earned him. He started with the obvious: bank records, employment history, family registries, expecting the usual: a name change here, a debt there, some small inconvenient truth she'd buried to make herself more marriageable. Instead, he found almost nothing. No siblings anyone could locate. No parents listed in any registry that led anywhere useful. A woman who seemed to have assembled herself out of thin air sometime in her 20s and simply continued existing quietly ever since, which, in his professional opinion, was either deeply suspicious or deeply sad. He wasn't sure which possibility bothered him more. Then came the parts that didn't add up in the other direction, the parts that made him feel, for the first time in years, faintly ridiculous for suspecting her at all. Amara had, over the previous 18 months, quietly paid off the hospital bills of no fewer than 6 strangers. Not through any charity with her name stitched onto a plaque, not through anything that could be traced back to buy her goodwill or a tax write-off. Just wire transfers to hospital billing departments, anonymous, unglamorous, and completely useless as leverage for anyone trying to build a case against her. She volunteered twice a month at a shelter 2 districts over, under a name that wasn't quite hers, doing the unremarkable work of handing out blankets and listening to people nobody else wanted to listen to. This isn't a woman hiding a crime, his lieutenant muttered to himself, staring at a spreadsheet of good deeds like it had personally insulted him. This is a woman hiding a personality flaw. Who does this much good and asks for this little credit? It's suspicious how not suspicious she is. But then there was the calendar. 1 week, every single month, Amara vanished. No hotel bookings, no flights, no calls to anyone in his surveillance net, which by this point included half the taxi drivers in Kongnam. She simply left, quietly, without announcement, and returned 7 days later, as though she'd stepped out for groceries. His lieutenant sat with that fact for a long time, turning it over like a coin that refused to land on either side. Every dangerous woman he'd ever investigated had something underneath the surface: a debt, a lover, a handler. Amara had only more silence. And silence, in his line of work, was the one thing you were trained never to trust. He didn't bring it to Min-jae yet. Not without proof. Not without something sharper than "she disappears sometimes and is suspiciously generous to strangers," which, when he imagined saying it out loud, sounded less like an intelligence briefing and more like a complaint about a nun. Instead, he watched. He watched Amara sit beside Min-jae at dinner, listening more than she spoke, laughing at things that weren't quite jokes yet, somehow making a man who ruled through fear look, for the first time in his life, unguarded. He watched her hands, always steady, except for the way they sometimes hovered a half-second too long before touching a doorframe, a chair, a glass, as though she were checking the world was exactly where she remembered leaving it. He noticed it. He filed it away. He didn't understand it yet. Not the reaching, not the hovering, not the careful, deliberate way she moved through rooms she'd walked through 100 times before, like someone memorizing a map she suspected she'd soon have to walk blind. That detail would come back to him. Later. Too late to matter in the way it should have. For now, his report to himself remained frustratingly incomplete. No evidence of betrayal, no evidence of danger, no evidence of anything except a woman who gives away money and time and affection like she's running out of some resource nobody else can see. He closed the file. He told himself he'd revisit it later, when something concrete finally surfaced. He had no idea concrete was already forming, not around Amara's secrets, but around his own ambitions, and the coup he hadn't yet admitted to himself he was already planning. The first file went missing on a Tuesday, which Min-jae would later find almost comically anticlimactic, as though betrayal, when it finally arrived, couldn't even be bothered to pick a more dramatic day of the week. It was a shipping manifest. Nothing catastrophic on its own. The kind of paperwork that tracked which of Min-jae's imports moved through which port on which night. Information valuable mostly to people who wanted him in prison or in a shallow grave, which, to be fair, described roughly half of Seoul's business elite. When his head of security reported it missing, Min-jae's first thought wasn't Amara at all. It was mild irritation. The way you feel when you can't find the TV remote and know, deep down, it's probably just under a couch cushion. Then the guard came forward. I saw her, the man said, shifting his weight like his shoes had suddenly become very interesting. Near the restricted floor. Around 11. She was asleep next to me at 11, Minjae said flatly, the way a man states a fact he assumes will end the conversation. The guard didn't argue. He also didn't back down. He just repeated, quieter this time, I saw her, with a particular stubbornness of a man who'd rather be wrong about something small than lie about something that might get him killed for silence. Minjae let it go. Once. Then the camera on the third floor blinked out for exactly 90 seconds. The exact 90 seconds. Security logs later confirmed, during which a second set of files disappeared from the archive room. And when the footage resumed, there was a woman's silhouette, brief and grainy, crossing the far edge of the frame before the feed clipped it off entirely. His lieutenant brought him the footage himself. His expression, the careful neutral of a man delivering news he'd hoped never to deliver. I'm not accusing her of anything, he said, which was, of course, exactly the sentence men use right before accusing someone of everything. But sir, this is the third incident. Minjae watched the footage 4 times. The silhouette could have been anyone. A similar build, similar hair, similar height. The visual equivalent of a police sketch drawn by someone who'd only glanced at the suspect through a rainstorm. But could have been anyone stopped being comforting somewhere around the second replay, because the alternative, that it wasn't anyone, that it was her, sat in his chest like a stone he refused to name. The organization noticed before he was ready for it to. That was the trouble with running an empire built on suspicion. Suspicion, once loosed, didn't discriminate. It didn't care that Amara had once dragged its founder out of a burning building. It didn't care about hospital bills paid in silence or blankets handed to strangers. Paranoia is a democratic disease. It infects everyone equally, and it always looks for the person standing closest to the boss with the least explainable past. Whispers moved through the household like smoke under a door. Impossible to see directly. Impossible to ignore. Guards who used to nod at Amara in the hallway now found reasons to look elsewhere. Staff who once accepted her small kindnesses. A coffee brought unasked. A question about their children remembered from months ago. Now flinched slightly when she entered a room, as though warmth itself had become suspicious. Amara noticed. Of course she noticed. She noticed everything. The same uncanny attention to detail that let her remember a stranger's daughter's name from a single conversation 8 months prior. But she said nothing. She didn't defend herself to the guards who avoided her eyes. Didn't demand answers from the lieutenant who now watched her with poorly disguised calculation. She simply moved through the tightening silence with the same quiet grace she'd always had, apologizing. For what? No one could say. As if kindness were something you could still owe people even after they stopped believing in yours. Minjae told himself it was nothing. He told himself the same thing 3 nights later, watching Amara's hand hover, just briefly, over the light switch before finding it. A half-second delay he'd seen a dozen times now and never once questioned. He was the man who never lost. He'd built an entire life on the principle that everything could be verified, tracked, understood, priced. And for the first time, he was staring directly at the one piece of evidence that should have told him everything. A woman who moved through her own home like she was memorizing it, and seeing nothing at all. Not yet. The coup was already 11 days from launching, and Minjae was still asking the wrong question. The sunset that evening was the kind Seoul rarely offered. A wide, unapologetic orange bleeding into violet over the Han River. The sort of sky that made even hardened men pause mid-sentence. Minjae had brought Amara to the rooftop out of guilt more than romance. Some unspoken apology for the tension thickening through his household like humidity before a storm neither of them had named out loud yet. She stood at the railing, watching the colors shift, her hand resting lightly on the concrete edge the way it always did now. Fingers spread, testing, though he still hadn't let himself wonder why. You're quiet, she said, without turning. I'm thinking. About the missing files. It wasn't a question, which unsettled him more than if it had been. You know about that. The whole house knows about that, Minjae. Silence has a very loud way of announcing itself. She finally turned, and there was no accusation in her face. No hurt performed for effect, just the same steady patience she'd greeted him with in that cafe over a year ago. Back when he was still a stranger, she'd apologized to about a noisy bracelet. Your guard thinks he saw me. Your cameras keep losing me. Your lieutenant looks at me like I'm a debt he hasn't collected yet. I don't think you did it. I know you don't. That's not the same as knowing I didn't. He opened his mouth to argue the distinction and found, for once, he had no argument. She let the silence sit a moment, then asked the question that would take him nearly a full year to fully understand, the one that would replay in his head at the worst possible moment, months from now, in a boardroom full of gunfire. If one day you couldn't recognize me anymore, she said quietly, eyes on the fading light instead of on him, would you still hold my hand? He laughed, not unkindly, just reflexively. The way a powerful man laughs at a riddle he assumes is rhetorical. What kind of question is that? A fair one. Emira, I would recognize you anywhere. Voice, walk, the ridiculous way you order coffee like it personally wronged you last time. He meant it as charm. It landed briefly, as exactly that. She almost smiled. But there was something underneath her expression he couldn't name, a kind of grief rehearsed so many times it had worn smooth, like a stone handled until its edges disappeared. That's not what I asked. Then ask me the real question. She looked at him for a long moment, and later, much later, he would understand that this was the exact moment she'd decided, again, not to. Not out of deception, out of mercy. She wanted him to keep the version of her he already loved for just a little longer, before the truth rearranged it into something he'd have to learn to love differently. Never mind, she said instead, and turned back to the river, letting the moment close like a door she'd chosen not to walk through. He should have pushed. Every instinct that had built his empire, the same instincts that could smell a lie in a boardroom from across a table, screamed that something sat underneath that question, something structural, something load-bearing. But a powerful man does not entertain riddles from his wife on a Tuesday evening with good wine and a rooftop view. And so Kang Min-jae, the man who never lost, let it go. He would think about that decision for the rest of his life. Here's a question worth sitting with, the same way Min-jae should have. If someone you loved asked you a strange, quiet question and then let it go, would you have chased the answer or let the sunset distract you too? Tell me honestly in the comments. Only the people who've never missed an obvious warning sign get to judge him for this one. 2 nights later, his lieutenant requested a private meeting, the kind that started with, I've been loyal to you for 11 years, and never ended anywhere good. I have proof now, he said, sliding a folder across the desk. Not guesses. Proof. Min-jae opened it slowly. The way a man opens a letter he already suspects is a diagnosis. Inside were photographs. Amara, time-stamped, standing outside a modest clinic 3 districts away, on 4 separate occasions over the past 2 months. No caption, no context. Just a woman, alone, entering a building his lieutenant had clearly decided meant something damning. What is this supposed to be? Min-jae asked. I don't know yet, his lieutenant admitted. But I intend to find out, before it finds us first. Neither man in that room understood, yet, that the coup already quietly assembling beneath their feet had nothing to do with Amara at all, and everything to do with the man holding the folder. The truth, when it finally arrived, did not knock politely. It came through the east stairwell of Min-jae's own headquarters at 9:47 on a Thursday night, dressed as 11 years of loyalty and carrying enough firepower to remind everyone in the building exactly how thin the line was between trusted lieutenant and walking liability. It had been building for months, longer if you counted the quiet arithmetic his lieutenant had been doing since well before Amara ever entered the picture. Loyalty, it turned out, has a shelf life when it's never properly compensated. And the man who'd spent a decade standing one respectful step behind Kang Min-jae had grown tired of the view. He'd been skimming shipments for over a year, rerouting product through channels Min-jae's ledgers never touched, and the missing files, the ones everyone had spent weeks blaming on a woman with no motive and no history worth stealing, had never been about Amara at all. They'd been about covering his own tracks. And Amara, unreadable, familyless, impossible to verify, had made the perfect scapegoat. A woman strange enough that suspicion clung to her without anyone needing actual evidence, which was, his lieutenant privately admitted, almost insultingly easy. All he'd had to do was mention her name near a missing file often enough, and paranoia did the rest of the work for free. The clinic photos had been his masterstroke, proof of nothing, suggestive of everything. Exactly the kind of ambiguous evidence that lets a man's imagination do all the incriminating on its own. When the coup finally launched, it launched loud. Armed men, hired through channels even Min Jae's network hadn't fully mapped, moved through the building floor by floor. And for the first time in over a decade, King Min Jae found himself exactly where his rivals had always hoped to put him. Cornered, outnumbered, and completely out of leverage. 11 years, Min Jae said, staring at the man he'd trusted with his life more times than he could count, now standing across a boardroom with a gun steadier in his hand than his voice. You let me suspect my own wife for 11 days over what you did for 11 years. She was useful, his lieutenant said, and there was no pleasure in it, just the flat exhaustion of a man who'd run out of better justifications. A woman nobody could verify, disappearing for days at a time, hiding something. You wanted a villain that wasn't me. I gave you one. She never hid anything that hurt this family. She hid something. That was enough. It was in that exact moment. Gunfire already breaking out one floor below. Security scrambling. Chaos folding the building into something closer to the burning warehouse where this entire story had started. That Amara stepped through the boardroom door. She hadn't been told to stay away. She'd simply always had a habit of walking toward the sound of trouble instead of away from it. The same instinct that had once dragged a bleeding stranger out of a fire before she even knew his name. Amara, get out! Min Jae started, but she was already moving, already reaching for him through the smoke and scattering chaos exactly the way she had that very first night, like history looping back to check its own work. The confrontation that followed was fast and ugly. His lieutenants hired men clashing with Min Jae's remaining loyalists, gunfire chewing through wood paneling that had never once, in 11 years, needed to survive a firefight. In the chaos, the truth came apart at the seams entirely. One of the guards, cornered and desperate to save himself, finally admitted what he'd actually seen the night the first file went missing. Not Amara at all, but the lieutenant himself, disguised in the dim light, banking on nobody looking twice at a woman everyone had already decided to distrust. The frame collapsed all at once, the way frames always do the moment someone finally checks the evidence instead of the rumor. Min Jae rushed toward Amara through the wreckage, shouting her name over the gunfire, reaching for her hand the exact way he had reached, uselessly, for a stranger's memory 3 months after a warehouse fire. She didn't reach back. She stood perfectly still in the chaos, her head turning, not toward him, not toward the sound of her name, but toward the direction of his voice, searching for it the way someone searches for a lighthouse through fog too thick to see through it all. And Kang Min Jae, a man who had spent his entire life priding himself on knowing everything, finally understood he'd been looking directly at the truth for over a year and had never once actually seen it. The gunfire stopped. The lieutenant didn't survive the hour, cut down by his own hired men when the coup collapsed faster than his ambition had planned for. The way betrayal always seems to eat the men who architect it first. But none of that registered to Min Jae in the moment that mattered. All that registered was Amara, standing 3 feet away, reaching for a voice instead of a face. Amara. He said it quieter this time, testing. She turned toward him immediately, correctly this time, and something in his chest cracked clean open, the way a dam doesn't leak so much as simply stop existing. You've been reaching for my voice, he said. Not my hand, not my face, my voice. She didn't deny it. She'd run out of reasons to keep denying anything, and maybe some small, tired part of her was relieved. I have a condition, she said finally, the words coming slow, like something she'd rehearsed 100 times in the mirror and never once said out loud. Retinitis pigmentosa. It's been taking my sight for almost 2 years now. Slowly, piece by piece, from the edges in. The clinic. The vanished week every month. The hovering hand before every door frame, every light switch, every glass. Not carelessness, but memorization. The sunsets abandoned before the color fully died, because watching the light disappear had become its own quiet grief she couldn't afford to feel twice. The perfect memory for names and faces, paired with a mind that misplaced ordinary objects, because faces were the one thing she was racing to keep, and keys were simply not worth the fight. The bracelet, he said suddenly. the pieces slamming into place all at once. Ugly and obvious in hindsight, the way all devastating truths are. The night I met you, it wasn't nerves. You were listening for it. You used sound to place things. I've been doing it for a while, she said. You get good at hiding it if you have a reason to. Why hide it from me? And there it was. The question underneath the question she'd asked him on that rooftop. The one he'd laughed off with good wine and bad timing. Her eyes, still fixed somewhere just past his shoulder, finally found something closer to his actual face. Because you're the last thing I wanted to see clearly, she said. I wanted to keep your face. Not a photograph, not a memory somebody else described to me. Yours. I didn't want you looking at me like I was already gone. I wanted a little more time being your wife before I became your patient. The lieutenant's betrayal had used her silence as a weapon. It had never once occurred to him that the silence had been protecting something far more devastating than a crime. It had been protecting him from a grief she decided to carry alone so he wouldn't have to carry it early. Min-jae didn't say anything clever. For possibly the first time in his adult life, he didn't have a single strategic thought in his head. He simply took her hand, properly this time, deliberately. The way you hold something you've just understood, you almost lost, without ever knowing it was slipping, and held on. You dragged me out of a fire once, he said, without knowing my name. I'm not letting go now that I know yours. Min-jae, you asked me a question on that roof. If one day you couldn't recognize me anymore, would I still hold your hand? He tightened his grip, just slightly. Yes, every time. Whatever's left of your sight, whatever isn't. I'm not a man who needs you to see me to be loved by you. I never was. She laughed, wet, surprised. The sound of someone who'd spent 2 years bracing for a reaction she'd never actually let herself receive. That's disgustingly poetic for a man who once threatened a shipping broker with a letter opener. I contain multitudes. 6 months later, the organization ran differently. Leaner, quieter, with a new second-in-command who'd earned the position through competence instead of proximity, and a standing rule that no accusation moved forward without evidence that could survive daylight. Amara's sight continued its slow retreat, and she met it the way she met everything, without spectacle, without self-pity, one modification at a time. A cane she'd initially hated and eventually named. A home relearned by touch and sound. A husband who'd started narrating sunsets out loud so she'd never lose the color even after her eyes finally did. She still left before full dark, out of habit more than necessity now. He still stayed until the last light went, holding her hand, describing violet fading into black the way some men describe stock portfolios, like it was the most important information in the world. Because for Kang Min-jae, the man who never lost, it finally was. If a story about love outlasting fear, betrayal, and even sight itself moved you even a little, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, would you have held on the way he did? Only the cold ones scroll past this ending without saying a word.